So I guess we'll start. Some more people may sort of drift in a little later. Can you just shut this front door so people can come in the back? So this was sort of pulled together at fairly short notice because Ravi and I are unfortunately both traveling again. He's going off to Brazil. I'm only going to Delhi tomorrow. But this came from a conversation that we had a few weeks back at ISC when we were having a conversation about Working Group 2, and he was just off to the hard final negotiations for Working Group 3, which is probably the most difficult part of this process, because eventually that ties in with the FCCC negotiations next year in Paris. So this is the beginning of the science that will be dealt with. So just very quickly, for those of you who, I think more or less everybody here knows what we're talking about, but those of you who are not fully aware, this is basically a discussion or a presentation on the output of the IPCC Assessment Report 5, Working Group 3, which is looking at mitigation, where evidently all the money and the challenges lie. And yes, and the politics are absolutely there, deeply in that. And Professor Ravindranath has been part of this process for many years. This is probably your third cycle, isn't it? Fourth. Okay, so this is his fourth assessment report, which means that he's really one of those few people who have survived. Most people who've done two usually drop out by the third one, who survived this process. But I think the interesting thing about him, apart from the fact that he's extremely well published and he runs an excellence center at ISC, is that his experience is actually local to global. So we were just chatting just now. I mean, he spent maybe 7 to 10 years in Astra's famous experiment that many of us have watched and been part of, dropping in and out at UNGRA from the early 80s, isn't it? Yeah, early 80s. So he actually spent 7 years in a village, actively being involved with a whole range of energy, water, biomass, and development-related questions. So when he talks about stuff that's happening at global level, it is with a considerable amount of real-life experience of trying to make actual changes on the ground, which is really, really tough. And he was just sharing with me that his daughter was also born in UNGRA, which I think is a real test. I mean, normally what happens is that you go out and you send your kids out to Yale or Harvard or Cambridge or MIT, and they're born in city hospitals. Again, for those of us who've worked in this space, it's really nice to know that we have more and more people who are able to connect practice on the ground with theory building and sort of very advanced research. And unfortunately, the country has very few such people, because that's really what we have to bring to the world in some senses, saying that if we have to make this stuff work, we have to make those connections. So, I mean, his global stuff is great, but I think the really exciting stuff, maybe, you still go back to UNGRA? Sometimes, not too often, but yeah, there's so many other things that you have to do, is really to make these connections. And we have a team here that's starting to work on this long 5-year project, which is going to be looking at these questions and looking at the rural-urban transitions. So that kind of experience is really, is very important, and to know that you are building theory that is grounded, whether it's in the area of water or energy, or or dealing with livelihood and development, and in our case, dealing with settlements, is quite important. So I won't take any more time. I'll sort of leave the floor to Ravi. He has lots of slides and things to talk about. Some of them will be quite technical, but maybe we can sort of jump into questions at the end of the session. And there's a short, sort of, after he's finished, we're going to ask one of his colleagues from ISC to talk about the chapter on human settlements from Working Group 3, which is led by two friends of ours. In fact, we're working on a joint proposal together. Karen Sito, who some of you know from Yale. We have a couple of people from Yale here. And Shubhankar Dakal, they're sort of old friends and colleagues. In fact, we are starting to work on a book together later this year that will bring together Working Groups 2 and 3 together. So this is the first time that we bring together cities, urban adaptation and urban mitigation, an attempt to bring that. So Dr. Chaturvedi will sort of describe that after that. So all yours. You're free to do whatever you want to. You have the floor. And you're wired, so you don't have to. And we're streaming now, no? Okay, so now you're streaming live to the web. So if people want to check you out on YouTube, you're there.
If I make a mistake on any of the graphs, I'll be caught. So, anyway, thank you, Aromer. And one good thing is that we both had at least one great common guru called Professor Amulya Reddy. I started my career with him. He was working on a center called Center for Application of Science and Technology to Rural Areas in Indian Institute of Science, which is rare. Indian Institute of Science, they think the only word they know is what a science and working with colleagues in Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial College, and not so much with panchayats and villages. But this professor was great. He worked on rural technologies, how science and technology can transform rural areas. That was the role, because 95% of my colleagues work on things which have nothing to do with rural area. Actually, 80% of PhD theses are based on modeling. That means they don't do any field work, they don't do any real time or not real time, real groundbreaking work. It's simply modeling. That's easy, with all these computer models. So, coming back to my presentation, I'm very happy that recently we had an occasion to invite Aromer. See, two institutions are hardly a kilometer apart. We should be working together much more, and I hope this is a good beginning that we can start. There are colleagues in my institute interested in issues in which you are interested. This institute is working on housing, energy, water. So we also have people working, and so maybe we should really find a mechanism to blend or synergize our strengths, I think. So now we'll come back to this. There's a switch. Oh, thank you. So, this one, yeah. No, it's still not working. This is always a problem. Yeah. Okay. Well, for those of you who are not very familiar with IPCC, it has three. IPCC is an Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Every 5 to 6 years, they have been publishing new updates of science of climate, impacts and adaptation, and mitigation of climate change. There are three working groups. Working group 1, which is about the physical science basis, the science of climate change, climate projections, and so on. Working group 2, it's about the impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, in which Dr. Aromer also was involved. And working group 3 is a mitigation of climate change. Of course, these two reports, all the three have been released. And there is one report called synthesis report. There are three working group reports, each book weighing maybe 2 kgs, and how to really synthesize that and make it sensible to the policy maker, which is a challenge. I happen to be an author for this also, in addition to being an author for this. Well, IPCC reports are huge, as I was saying. It's almost 1.5 to 2 kgs. Most people don't want to carry in their handbags in the airports. It's about 2,000 pages report, and there are 235 authors. And one of the great thing about IPCC is it goes through such intense peer review process, which is unheard of in science. When you submit a paper to a journal, the editor will have a quick look and send it to 2 reviewers, and that's all. If both the reviewers say it's good, your paper is in. But here, imagine for a 2,000 page report, you had 38,000 comments. So each of us had to deal with literally thousands of comments. If you send a paper to a journal, if you get back 2,000 comments, you will say, forget it. I will not submit this paper again. I will write a new paper. It will take less time than to address 2,000 comments. But we addressed like that, and Aromer knows about that. So that's a real great challenge. Well, let me say like an abstract, the key summaries. So without serious action, the warming could cross 4 degrees C threshold, which is, according to scientists, is catastrophic. And second is limiting warming to 2 degrees, which is considered not so safe. 1.5 degree is considered as safe, and many say 2 degrees too much. Of course, there is a story behind why people stuck. Politicians want a target. If we want to do something, we need a target so that we can work towards that. So suddenly Tony Blair, just before G8 meeting, Gleneagles in Scotland, he suddenly called a few scientists, said, I want a target because I want meeting all my G8 colleagues. So I want to make a splash on climate change. So overnight, they cooked up 2 degrees, though we realize it's not the right one. But it's good to give a target to the politicians. So is it possible to stabilize warming at 2 degrees? Though, as I'm repeating, 2 degrees is too much. You have to stabilize warming at 1.5 or less. But almost cross 1 degree. So we have a very small cushion left. So is it possible? That's a big question policymakers are asking is it possible to stabilize warming below 2 degrees? That's the biggest challenge facing, and what needs to be done to stabilize warming below 2 degrees. That's all about the politics, the science of climate change is about one question. So stability, it's possible, but very difficult. That's what I'm going to show now. Stabilization of greenhouse gases or staying within the carbon budget to be within below 2 degrees needs immediate peaking and steep decline. The current emissions are continuously increasing. You have to peak, they have to immediate decline. Second is there is a need to phase out emissions entirely in the long term. There should be zero emissions. Imagine, unless you have a technological revolution, which is unlikely, we want to drive cars, we want electricity and everything. There is no way we can get, but that's what is required to stay within 2 degree dangerous limit. And there is a need for action, immediate action in all regions of the world. It's not just the US has to do or Western Europe, everyone has to work. Even if the emissions from US and Western Europe become zero, the warming will continue because of emissions from China and India and so on. So which is really a tall order. Imagine having these 3 targets for policymakers, and when they meet in Paris, I'm sure all of you know, the next deadline for a major agreement is in Paris in 2015. So in fact, they fixed the date for 2015, assuming that IPCC reports will come in 2014. They will have 1 year to digest that, and then they take some decision. So far, I don't think they have digested these reports. Of course, shifting to a low carbon emission pathway requires large scale transformation in energy and settlements. In fact, and then shift in investment from coal and natural gas to massively into renewables and so on. And there is a need to change in the lifestyle, whether Americans or Indians, especially urbanites, we have to change our lifestyles. It's all about, if you ask people, some people say the whole thing about climate change is about changing lifestyles. If you change your lifestyles, things can happen automatically, though of course it won't happen so easily. I will just show a summary. The working group once said it's got the 4 RCP scenarios. They're basically, it's 2.6, 4.8, 6 and 8.5 watts per meter square. That's the level of warming, say by 2100. If you have a target of 2.6 watts per meter square warming, 4, 6, 8.5, then there are so many pathways to reach this level, this level, this level. Policymakers have to choose where they want to be on this. Each level represents different levels of warming. So to stay with 2 degrees below, you have to be on this trajectory, which is extremely difficult. And what are the implications of 1 degree, 2 degree, 3 degree, 4 degree, 5 degree? Just to show one slide from working group 2, which I really like. If you want to show the whole thing in one slide, this is the one. You have the warming projections here, and in all likelihood, under the business as usual scenario, we are likely to be between 6 and 8.5 in all likelihood, unless there is a massive drastic transformational change. Those changes don't happen in the world so easily. So if there are no transformations, we are likely to be somewhere between here and there before maybe by 2050 or 2060 in the lifetime of many young people in this room. But the implications are many. Even at a 1 degree warming, you can see different color. White means neutral, yellow means moderate, red, purple means very high, the risk or damage. You can see here, even at 1 degree, Arctic ice, sea melt, corals, it's already, you're already in the red zone. So if you look at heat waves, even now there are tens of thousands of people dying due to heat stress around the world, and even this is one is a global mean. You should know global mean 2 degree means, it means different levels of warming to different regions. It could be global mean 2 could be 1.5 for Bangalore, and it could be 4, 5 or 6 to Canada and Siberia and so on. So there is a huge variation. Global mean doesn't mean it's 2 degrees in Antarctica, Arctics, and to Bangalore to Washington. It varies. So if you just even a 1 degree warming in the Arctics, you could be in the red zone. Similarly, for heat waves, anything more global mean more than 1 degree means some regions will experience 3-4 degrees warming during certain weeks, certain months. Similarly, if you look at distribution impacts, anything more than 2 degrees, there could be a global impact on food production. And similarly, there are singular extreme events, extreme droughts, hurricanes, cyclones, and so on. Of course, that may require anything more than 2 degrees to be in the red zone. So like that, even at very low levels of warming projections, 1.5 to 2 degrees, you could be in the red zone for whether food production or Arctic sea ice melt or many other impacts. And why should a policymaker be worried about climate change? All our chief ministers, prime ministers, they get elected for 5 years, sometimes even less. Why should they worry about something which is going to happen in 30 years, 50 years, 100 years from now? That's a big question. I happen to be in many committees, and Ramar also would know in the number of MPs and so on, ministers, they say climate change is not their immediate concern. Actually, even many of our immediate concerns are not even their concerns today. So they have other concerns. So forget about climate change. Why would anyone worry about climate change? Initially, people thought it's a problem of the future. It's decades away. We are not responsible. US is responsible. That's the kind of things you hear even today from many senior politicians, even bureaucrats. They say the same thing. There are many IAS officers in Delhi. Unfortunately, there are some who have been transformed. There are some who still think, no, this is not our problem. This is a long-term, decadal away. We have more priorities, more worries. Maybe it's according to them. But in fact, if in the working group 2 clearly states there is so much scientific evidence that climate change is already impacting hydrological systems, it's impacting biodiversity, it's impacting health. In fact, I want to go into for example, if you take in response to ongoing climate change, many terrestrial, freshwater, and marine species have shifted their geographic ranges. There are seasonal activities have shifted, arrival of birds and so on, migration patterns have changed, abundance of species interactions have changed. There are many ecological changes already occurring, even at small warming of 0.8 to 1 degrees, different parts of the world. So imagine if the warming reaches 2 to 3 degrees, we don't know. So that means it's not something, I always stress more on the observed impact of climate change, the ongoing impact of climate change. A study in science showed that even there's negative impacts on crop yields. If there was no greenhouse gas elevation in the atmosphere, crop yields of wheat and maize should have been 5%, about 3 to 5% higher than what has been observed in the last 20 years. That means there are scientific evidence to show, modeling evidence to show that even the crop yields have already been adversely impacted. So this is not a problem of the future. If I have to make a presentation to anybody in the Ministry of Environment, or I will present only the observed impacts. I will not talk about future impacts. I will tell them the science is saying. So, well, let me come into the working group 3 after giving a brief introduction. I will talk about the trends in the flow and stocks of greenhouse gases, the mitigation pathways and measures in the context of achieving 2 degree stabilization and sustainable development, long-term mitigation pathways and options available, and then there are sectoral and cross-sectoral mitigation options. One of the issues this report stresses is it's not adequate to look at transport, buildings, agriculture separately. We need to take a cross-sectoral and integrated view to get maximum GHG reduction for any investment. And of course, there is a full chapter on human settlements, infrastructure and spatial planning, and my postdoc Dr. Rajiv will give some 10 minutes presentation on that, on a specific chapter, assuming you are more interested in that. Of course, the whole working group 3 report is about policies. What policies have worked, what have not worked. Actually, mostly policies have not worked. And coming to the greenhouse gas emissions trends, You can see from 1970 to 2010, the emissions have been continuously increasing, except during 2008, there was a small dip. I'm sure you know, because of the financial crisis, but again it's back. And if you take 1970 to 2000, the emissions grew by 1.3% per year. But now in the last decade, it has grown by 2.2%, despite all the talk of Kyoto Protocol, UNFCCC, global negotiations, Copenhagen, where all the prime ministers, presidents met for 3 days. Despite all of that, the emissions are growing, and CO2 concentration is going between 2 to 3 ppm per year. So there is no respite at all, despite all the talk, all the scientific developments, and whatever, all the NGOs and civil society and so on, emissions continue to grow. Of course, CO2 accounts for almost 65% of the total greenhouse gas emitting gases. And if you look at this graph, of course, didn't make it to the SPM because it's highly political. The US, if you take the historical one from the beginning of Industrial Revolution to the current period, 50 years, let's take the total cumulative emissions of the United States, China, India, and so on. You can see US accounts for almost 30% of the global emissions in the last 50 years. The China about 10%, Russia whatever 9%, and of course where is India is somewhere, India is only, it's like less than 2.9%. But if you take 2010 emissions, of course for the first time in this report we gave the consumption based estimate and the production based estimate. Production means China produced a lot of things for the world. So if you deduct all the things exported, what will be their emissions? And this is a production based, consumption based means exclude all the exports and so on. If you include production, where let's say all the steel, iron, aluminum produced in China, they consume a lot of it, they also export a little bit. But if you include all of that, almost 30% of the emissions in 2010 is contributed by China. So obviously China, US together today, see the US share has declined from 18 to 17, it will only continue to decline. So China, US together almost 30 plus 47, almost 50% of the emissions are originate from these two countries. If they don't do anything serious, there is no point in rest of the countries fighting with one another. But that's what's happening now. There is a fight is between European Union and India and so on and so forth. But the big guys are here, US and China, and in Copenhagen, they didn't want to even talk to one another. Barack Obama and the Chinese Prime Minister, they didn't want to even meet. Finally they met, of course. But that's the level of cooperation they have between these two. But now I hear they are talking to one another. Behind the UNFCCC doors, they are doing some bilateral things going on. And of course, if you look at the trends in emissions in the low income countries, there's like Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Saharan Africa, there hardly any change in their emissions. If you look at, of course, upper middle income like China, India, Brazil, South Africa, they're shooting up. Of course, Chinese per capita emissions are almost, I think, around 6 to 7 tons. By 2020, when the new agreements come into effect, China would have overtaken Western Europe. So the per capita emissions from China is almost 9 to 10 tons. It will be 9 to 10 tons by 2020, far higher than Western Europe. And India has gone and joined with China and formed a group called basic countries, Brazil, India, South Africa, and China. And I keep telling the ministry people that we should stay away from Chinese, because our emissions are 2 tons per capita. Chinese already 6 plus, and they will be crossing 9 plus. So we should not be with them. We should be with other developing countries. Throw China out, but they don't want to for political reasons. And Chinese are shooting from using our shoulders. But one of the most surprising things about the decomposition of GHG emissions, what contributes most, you can look at it. One, of course, is carbon intensity of energy, that is CO2 emitted per megawatt hour of electricity generated and so on, or energy intensity of GDP, how many megajoules you need to produce $1 of GDP, and population and GDP per capita. You can see there is a small change, but let's look at the last 10 years. Of course, energy intensity GDP is declining. That's slowly bringing down, but the population and GDP per capita is a one. In fact, there was a graph showing as the GDP, as the per capita income increases, emissions increase. Chinese, they opposed it, that graph was deleted. So they don't want to show that as China grows, their per capita emissions will grow. You know, they are so sensitive, even small things they don't want to see. Everybody knows, nobody can disagree, but still they didn't want that graph. So, but everyone knows that, but you can see this red business, carbon intensity of energy, you know, CO2, tons of CO2 emitted per megawatt hour of electricity generated. But you know, in the 70s, 80s and 90s, it was declining, it was contributing negatively. But you see in the last 10 years, because of enhanced massive coal combustion and consumption in China and to some extent India and other countries, it has increased. Maybe the share of hydroelectricity has declined, share of natural gas declined, coal is the cheapest fuel. So because of that, this is very bad news, because for every unit of electricity generated, we are burning more coal, emitting more CO2, which is a bad news. Well, this is something again Chinese didn't like, but it survived somehow. Let's see what is the share of different sectors. People always think, when I have given many talks, see what are the sources? Transportation, cars. Yes, cars do contribute, but there are other sectors which are more important. For example, if you look at AFLU, agriculture, forest, land users, it accounts for almost 25% of the emissions. Out of 50 gigatons, 25% of the emissions are from land-based, livestock, agriculture, rice production, deforestation. Of course, transport accounts for 14%. Of course, these are direct emissions. Building, for example, only 6%. If you exclude the electricity we use, is not included in this building, but it's included in power generation. But if you include this, what the indirect emissions, the electricity used in this building is leading to emissions of CO2 in some power plant. You know, the industry, out of this energy supply, industry accounts for 11%, buildings 12%. So building is significant, share of 12 plus 6, almost 16% of the emissions are from buildings. And also, of course, you can't forget agriculture, forests and so on. And of course, the next question is, can we stabilize global warming below 2 degrees? This is a big challenge. What are the, of course, you can't do it in next 5 years, 10 years, so that's why we talk about long-term mitigation pathways. And of course, there are many graphs. There you need, of course, you need to be closer to the your graph and so on. I will try to explain few of them. But here, by 2030, evolution of direct, indirect CO2 emissions from electricity generation only, and GHG emissions over time by sectors in baseline scenario. This is direct emissions, this is direct plus indirect. Let's look at direct plus indirect. Direct emissions by transportation by 2030, you can see compared this line is a 2010, this is the baseline, 2010 level. You can see the building has the highest increase in emissions projected by 2030s, 2050s and 2100, of course followed by industry. And energy supply, actually it may decline, not as high as assuming that the renewables will contribute to increasing share of the electricity generation. And this is one graph I would like to explain a little bit for those of you who are not very familiar with RCP. I already explained to you there are 4 RCP scenarios. Let us say RCP 2.6 means the CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere will be around 490. Let's say 500 ppm, around it, 500 ppm. Today, the concentration is almost close to 450 ppm. It used to be 270, 280 at the beginning of industrial revolution. From 270 to 280, it has reached 450. So we are only another 40, 50 ppm left to cross the threshold of 1.5 degree or 1.7 degree. So that means, and if we can hold the global greenhouse gas concentration at around 490 ppm, the warming will be around 1.5. You can stabilize the warming. That means annual GHG emissions, currently it's about 50 gigatons of CO2. It has to sharply decline and it should become almost 0. That means we completely stop using coal, natural gas and petroleum fuels, and also maybe emissions from forest, livestock, agriculture should all become almost 0. It's imaginary. I mean, it's only you can write in novels. So obviously it's impossible to reach hold the warming at 1.5 degrees. We have crossed the first dangerous threshold has been crossed. So next is 4.5. 4.5 means 650 ppm and the warming will be 2.4 degrees. As I showed, even a global warming of less than 1 degree is having impact on agriculture, forests, water resources and so on. So 2.4 degree will be also very dangerous. But can we hold the GHG concentration at 650? Maybe. But in all likelihood, we will be between 6 to 8, that means between 850 ppm and 1370 ppm. This is something which, if you understand, it's good. When you read an IPCC report, people talk about all these things. You should understand this. And of course, these are the concentrations of CO2 equivalent, in the sense carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, all combined using some global warming potential. We call it as CO2 equivalent. So you can see 430 to 480 ppm. You have to be on this band to stabilize warming at 1.5, which is not likely. In the same way, in all likelihood, the global concentrations, if the world doesn't do anything drastic, anyway it could be between 750 or 850, 750 to outside 1300 or 1200. You may ask, do we have so much coal, petroleum and so on? I will show you that. We have enough coal to reach even this level in the world. Of course, there is a huge table, massive table in the IPCC report, which clearly shows if you want to stabilize warming at different levels, 430 to 480 ppm or 580 to 680 ppm or greater than 1000, then what's the cumulative emissions you are permitted? Emission permits. Currently, we are emitting around 50, actually it may be 55 gigatons or billion tons of CO2 equivalent GHGs probably is the emission in 2014. 2010 it was close to 50, almost 50. But how much you are permitted? Between 2011 to 2050, in the next 40 years, you cannot burn more than cumulatively 550 to 1300. That means something like 13, 14 to 30. But whereas we are emitting already 55. So that means we have to bring it down to 15 immediately in the next 20 years. That's one of the biggest messages from this report is you have to take action soon. If you delay, it becomes too expensive and it becomes too difficult. That's and also very highly dangerous for natural ecosystems and so on. So this that kind of a graph is there, table is there, you can study it in detail later. So mitigation requires major technological institution changes, including upscaling of low and zero carbon energy. In the sense, we really have to shift to solar, wind, biomass and maybe nuclear, big challenge. So if you really have a stabilization targets of 580 to 720, 430 to 480 and so on, these are different colors. What is a upscaling of, say, renewable energy, for example? If you want to be on this 430 to 480, which is unlikely, you really have to upscale the share of low carbon or zero carbon energy anywhere between 145 to 310, almost 3 times, 4 times, which is unlikely. And another way of looking at it is that the current emissions are around 50. If you want to hold it below 50 gigatons CO2 for the next 20 years, what are all the options available? And if you are on this, that is below 50 gigatons, and then the advantage between 2030 2050, the emission reduction required is annually only 3%. But if you are not on this, but if you are on this trajectory, if you are crossing 55 gigatons, which we are almost crossing now, the annual emission reduction is required is 6%, which is not small, very high. It's simply impossible for the world to cope with that level of reduction. And of course, most people want to know what's the cost of stabilization. Can the world afford? This is one of the big questions policymakers want to know. The literature is limited and also difficult. Of course, there is one graph, one number which all the newspapers, New York Times, Guardian, they splashed. They said that it's affordable for the world to hold the warming below 2 degrees. That was one of the headlines of one of the, I think, Guardian also. It's affordable. That's a big story message. Even John Kerry gave a statement next day after this. Yes, it's affordable. He also quoted that. It's not easily affordable. So if you really want to be somewhere, say between 480 to, this is, let's forget this. if you want to between 480 to 530 or 530 to 580, what's the annual loss, in consumption, baseline consumption, let's say GDP, what's annual loss in GDP? You could be between 0.6 to 1.5% absolute loss in GDP. Of course, India, you may say India is growing at around 5 to 6%. Can we afford to lose between say 0.6 to 1.5%? Or you tell a politician, they will say, they will throw you out. So we don't want every 0.1. If we talk to Chidambaram, we'll say every 0.1% of GDP is important. So this is literally impossible. Of course, everyone looked at this one, they said 0.3%. John Kerry looked at this 0.3 and he said it's affordable. He was very happy. But even 0.3%, if you ask Chidambaram, he will say, no, I can't afford to lose 0.3% GDP just to protect climate. So let's come to the sectoral. I will not go into the details of the sectors. Each sector has several technological options, and I will skip some of them. There are large number of course, building sector. If you don't do anything seriously, emissions from building sector could increase by 50 to 150% because of urbanization and increase GDP and increase use of electricity and everything in the homes and air conditioning and so on. It could increase anywhere between 50 to 150%. Then of course, the large number of technologies you all know. I don't need to go into that. It's the same with industry also. Of course, industry provides actually a very big opportunity to immediately reduce emissions, especially because of steel, aluminum, cement. They're all big ticket opportunities. We really have to look at them. Unlike going into each farmer trying to change his livestock management habit, which is not worth doing, you should really go into the big guns of the industry. Of course, agriculture, forest, this is our area. One of the most contentious issue in the IPC report was on the role of bioenergy. Biofuels produced from corn, and sugarcane, oil palm, and so on. What role it can play? And number one, number two, and the beauty of bioenergy, you can produce wood, burn it, and produce electricity. The Institute of Science has developed biomass gasifiers, and when the CO2 comes out, you can collect the CO2 and store it back in the sun. That means you can produce electricity and have negative emissions. You can, using the CO2 in the atmosphere, you can grow trees, burn it, and all the CO2 that comes, you can collect it and store it back in the geological reservoirs. That means that's a negative mitigation option. In fact, the newspapers next day wrote, this is one of the headline statement, bioenergy is very critical, but they say it's very risky and there are a lot of risks involved. But if you really have to achieve 2 degree stabilization, 1.5 degree stabilization, bioenergy becomes a very critical component of policies to address mitigate climate change. And just to summarize, we really have to decarbonize majority of electricity generation by 2050. Shift to renewables, shift to nuclear, though I'm not in favor of nuclear, but that's one of the options on the table. And phasing out of coal generation without carbon capture and storage. I'm sure some of you have heard about, if you have a coal plant, all the CO2 emitted can be collected and stored back in the geological reservoirs. That means you produce electricity using coal, but no net emissions. This is a favorite technology of the Americans, and increasing low carbon, increasing solar, wind, hydroelectricity, and carbon capture storage in bioenergy, and changing consumption patterns, such as, in fact, one of the things which we talked about, in fact, there's a nice graph which was, I'm sure all of you know, to produce whatever 1 kg of meat compared to produce 1 kg of milk or 1 kg of whatever vegetables and fruits and so on. The most energy intensive, carbon intensive product is red meat, and red meat is not good for your heart also. But that's, in fact, we talk about very carefully that the world should really shift away from red meat, which is from the health perspective, but it's very good for climate change also. Reducing deforestation, and there are lots of other opportunities. And also, of course, people talk about what we call co-benefits. If you do something to reduce emissions, it also helps your health and so on and so forth. So if you look at the ppm particulate matter concentration, I don't know what's the PM concentration in Bangalore, but the WHO says it should be less than 20 grams per whatever meter cube or something. but in many parts of the world you can see China, India, and it's already above, instead of being below 20, it's more than 70. So it's already, we are living in a dangerous world. Recently there was a WHO report saying air pollution is one of the biggest killers. So if you really shift to renewables, and if you shift to natural gas and so on, the emissions will decline and you will have a lot of other benefits. Well, maybe I will skip some of them. Okay, the other thing is there is a need for huge shift in investment patterns from coal, natural gas to renewables. For example, IPCC gives numbers, what's the investment required. On an average, you may anywhere need between 400 to 500 billion dollars of investment into clean energy technologies, which is quite a lot. And this is another interesting graph. It is in the human settlements chapter. It shows this is the emissions per capita CO2 emissions by sector. This is the total emission. The US is about 17 tons of CO2 per capita. India is about less than 2. If you look at the share of, say, the US emissions, industry, industry, transport, residential building, and other sectors. You can see industry, transport, buildings. These three account for almost 3/4 of the US emissions. But if you look at India, we are, if you look at these colors, number one is industry, others are all very small. So if you want to be on the 2 degree, this is the per capita spread of, China is here almost close to 6, this is in 2010. So they will cross Western Europe, global average. This is the next one. Rich countries average is, including US, Canada, it's 10. If you take Western Europe, it's less than 9. China is inching to the Western Europe levels. And you look at the emissions required to be on a 2 degree target. It's simply everyone has to crash to this level, which looks highly unlikely under any stretch of imagination. This is a very telling figure. And of course, there are lots of headlines around the world, and Guardian wrote, the Economic Times wrote, this Guardian wrote, IPCC report, world must urgently switch to clean energy sources. Another report from Guardian said, IPCC climate change report, averting catastrophe is eminently affordable. That was something. And New York Times wrote, climate efforts falling short, UN panel says. And BBC had headline, world must end dirty fuel use. And CNN also said, modest hope to slow warming, but no free lunch, UN warns. But these are kind of headlines. Even all newspapers also carried the story. And John Kerry, the next day, he gave a statement, we already know that climate science is unambiguous, and that every year the world defers action, the costs only grow. But focusing on grim realities versus promising realities staring at us in the right face. This report makes very clear we face an issue of global willpower, not capacity. So he also said somewhere else it's affordable. Of course, the British Energy Secretary, Energy and Climate Secretary said, urges EU to lead whatever, climate fight globally. And now I'll request my colleague Rajiv to give maybe 10 minutes on urban settlement.
How will this work? Backward. And this is for what?
Laser.
Point at this is. Okay. Thank you, Professor Ravi, and thank you, Dr. Aromar, for giving me this opportunity to speak on the human settlement chapter of this IPCC report. I'm not an expert of this, so please excuse me if I make any mistakes. And also, please point out if there are anyone. I have looked at this chapter as a student, because I have been heard Professor Ravi saying like multiple times that if a PhD student is looking at the IPCC reports, then he gets to know the whole literature and also gets to know where the problems are, where are the areas where one can do the research. So I have looked at this chapter from that perspective. And to begin with, I would like to introduce the link between climate change and cities. Cities, as part of the human settlements, are very important because they are one of the most prominent sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Right now, approximately 70% of all the GHGs are coming from, especially from the energy sources are coming from these areas, and also because these are the sources of emission, so they offer considerable mitigation potential. If we mitigate these sources of emissions, then it can lend a lot of like mitigation potential, and yet due to the impacts of climate change, cities stands to lose the most. And so let me dwell on the GHG emission part of the cities. As of now, like we have, like if you take this, according to this IPCC report, the share of cities in the total emissions is approximately 44%. If we take all the emissions in like energy, land use change, everything taken together, but if we consider only the energy part of the emissions, then it is approximately up to 70% of the emissions. However, there are very few studies which have been examining this aspect of the GHG emissions from the cities, and particularly this estimate, which is 44% of the emissions, is coming from only one estimate, which is the scope study. So there is a need to do further studies on this aspect, especially like if we take the cities altogether. We have sectoral assessment. For example, as Professor Ravi has shown in these slides, that we have assessments available for building sector, we have assessment available for transport sector, we have assessments available for different other sectors. But especially when taking cities altogether, we have very little estimates, and also the confidence level in those estimates is very less. And one implication of this situation is that if we know very little about the emission sources, then we cannot be very sure about the mitigation potentials, which is on the offer by when. And I will dwell on these issues as I go further. Cities, population is one of the major drivers of the GHG emissions in cities, and population currently approximately 52% of the global population dwells in the cities. And going forward, there are estimates from various agencies that the population, the global population in cities will rise up to 70% of the total world population. And this rise will fuel a lot of future emissions in GHGs from the cities. So urbanization is one of the like major part, which is, and the population which is increasing in the urban areas is going to increase the emissions in future. However, the biggest problem is that these increases in population growth, these increases in infrastructure will be happening in the countries which are poorer, which are especially in the developing domain. And in many of those countries, the governance aspect, the technological aspect, the financial and institutional capacities are very limited. And given these limitations, it will be quite difficult to realize whatever mitigation potential these cities are offering. So that is a matter of concern when it comes to the mitigation potential from the cities. And if we look into the different mitigation opportunities which are available in the cities, is that we have energy efficiency, we have renewables, we have passive designs such as cycling lanes and things like that. We have other interventions like improved management, improved technology, reduction in waste, reduction in demand, and we have these things fairly available in all the sectors. So we have the intervention opportunities which are listed in the IPCC report. These opportunities are listed and one can go and see them. And if we want to estimate the mitigation potential, it is very important for us to understand what is driving the emissions in terms of per capita emissions. However, it has been very difficult so far to completely pinpoint the emissions which are taking place in the urban areas onto one or couple of factors. There are many factors, including income levels. As income increases, their expenditure will increase. They will have cars, they will have different amenities, and of course, the per capita income will increase. The population increase will again add to the GHG emissions. However, all these factors play differently in different cities. If you're sitting in a city like Europe, then these factors will be playing differently. If you're sitting in China, then it will be quite different. And here we have one example from 4 cities of China. Even within China, we have this situation that in Beijing, from Beijing to Shanghai to Tianjin to Chongqing, in all these cities, we have the relative contribution of all these factors is quite different, and even they vary from year to year. So it is quite very difficult to pinpoint to the exact drivers of the emissions. So it is again a problem to pinpoint the mitigation opportunities which exist in these areas. And so this point is also like mentioned in IPCC report that across the urban areas, it will be like if we use like we have to co-locate like high residential areas. We have to like if we want to do effective mitigation in the urban areas, then we have to take into account the land use mixes. We have to take into account the increasing public accessibility and increasing investment in public transit, etc. For example, this schematic shows you about different land use patterns. For example, here we have different like these are the settlements. Here the dwelling apartments. These could be the amusement parks or the parks where people may be using for recreational purposes. And here people work, factories and offices. However, if they're situated quite far apart from each of them, then a travel will be required. People have to travel from one place to another. However, in a different mix. So here is a case where the land use mix has been demonstrated. Here we have the building, we have the parks, amusement parks, as well as the workspace quite near to each other. So in that case, the travel could be minimized. So these are one of the possibilities. However, the problem here is that we cannot put a number. We cannot put a global number on these activities because these activities and these issues are very city specific. We have to do city level detailed analysis to understand these dynamics and understand these different mitigation potentials. So So, and then all across the world, we have a couple of cities, like many cities, approximately 42 cities, which have been taking different actions on climate change. And these actions like range from energy efficiency to increased use of renewables and various other options. However, these it is very difficult to completely add them together at the global stage. Because they have different baselines, they have different benchmarks, they have different rules, and they are operating under different sort of frameworks altogether. So these are some of the examples of different mitigation measures which is being implemented across different cities in the world. And if the climate change mitigation has been taken place in the cities, then it will also accrue a lot of co-benefits, such as savings of the public money, increased access to energy, health benefits associated with air and water quality, productivity increases in the urban centers, as well as it will also impart the competitiveness, because going forward there will be standards, there will be certificates which will be issued to different kind of sustainability standards. So in that context, within that market, it will be quite beneficial to have these kind of things. And then, I have read through this chapter as a student. As I said, I'm not a very great expert in this area, especially the urban settlements as recently. So, but I have got some very interesting points for you, that there are certain gaps which exist in this domain of human settlements, and which a student can utilize, and he can capitalize on that to build his research themes. First of all, there is a lack of consistent and comparable emissions data at local scales, and as a result of that, we don't have any, like as I said, that we have only one number which talks about that the cities may be contributing 44% in the total global emissions. But that number is also very shaky. We don't have very much confidence in that number. So this is an area of concern. Then there's a little scientific understanding of the magnitude of the emissions reduction from altering urban forms and different savings which it might accrue, because these things will vary from one city to another, and this has to be investigated, and these things are still not being done at a large scale across different countries, more so in the Indian context. And also there's a lack of consistency and comparability of local emissions accounting methods, making cross-city comparisons of emissions or climate action plans quite difficult. And then there are a few evaluations of urban climate action plans and the effectiveness. These things have not been well evaluated. And then there's a lack of scientific understanding of how cities can prioritize mitigation strategies, local actions, investments, and policy responses that are locally relevant. However, these points are very, very important if one city or a country wants to move ahead with the mitigation efforts. And then there are large uncertainties about future urbanization trajectories, although urban form and infrastructure will play large roles in determining future emission pathways. So I have this much. I think I have not bothered you too much. Yes, so thank you very much.
Here, in Europe and America, there are many cities. The governments may not be doing much, but the many cities, there are mayors and municipalities. They are taking a lot of initiative. They have their own targets to reduce emissions in the US. There was a meeting of all. There are some 55 mayors of big cities. They have agreed to have targets to reduce their emissions. Of course, most of the cities are from Europe and US, Yokohama, Toronto, Hamburg, Chicago, and Portland, and so on. So this is. The governments may not do much, but cities themselves have serious, especially in California is a world leader in many things. And if you look at what are they're trying to do, largely they're focusing on buildings, how to reduce energy consumption on emissions from buildings. They're looking at transport, but they're not looking at urban land use. Of course, this requires a lot of changes, but you can't change New York and London. But you can, or Delhi, for example, you can change the news. Tumkur, which will become a big city. We can plan and manage Tumkur or Mysore and so on. But what can you do for London, which is already a 2,000-year-old city? But here is big opportunities. Land use, energy supply, waste. But most of them are focused on buildings and transport. Of course, they are also important. And this is something you should really, I request all of you to study this. What are the opportunities, how we should really organize your cities. This is a low carbon scheme, this is high carbon. Right now in the US, people live in suburbs, all the offices are in the downtown. So people drive 20, 30 kilometers. So this is some sort of a mixing, the high density in the sense, there's another nice graph showing if you want to have 1,000 people, and if you have single story buildings, how much land you need, if you have 3 stories, and if you have very high New York style, Manhattan style, how much land is required. And also what's the energy involved, consumed by these 3 examples of residential colonies. So it's very nice to see that if you mix the workplace and the residences, their emissions are likely to be low, not just transport but many other things. And also connectivity, you can have, if you have small roads like in Karibata or something where next to the main street all the tall buildings are there, where so that people just get down and walk to the bus, and the big houses are far away from the the main central street. So that way where you locate tall buildings, if they are located closer to the main streets, people would simply have to walk to the metro or train or buses. And of course, accessibility, here you have only separated workplace and home, and you drive like in the US cars. This is of course you're closer and you have metro and buses. So I just wanted to show this slide again.
Thanks. So that was very useful. You guys can jump in. Questions?
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you so much for this inspiring talk. In one of the slides, you mentioned that 25% or more of the emissions comes from agriculture and FOP forest.
Yeah.
And another slide showed that 70% comes from cities.
That is energy section, or energy.
Energy consumption.
From energy source.
And from the agriculture?
So that is including land. You have energy, land, livestock. So if you take only energy, then the bulk of the emissions come from cities. But if you include agriculture and forests and so on, then the city emissions will be 40%, 44%.
Thank you, sir. That was a very enlightening presentation. I had a related question. This recent research that has come out of Netherlands that says that land is actually sinking in some areas where it's that sink is almost 10 times more than the sea level rise. It is somewhat related, with climate change. It's not really directly climate change, but the impacts of that related with sea level rise. Is there anything that's covered in this report which looks at other processes which are impacting higher? Is there a mitigation strategy which is related with these parallel processes that are going on?
No, for some impacts there is no mitigation. If there is going to be a heavy cyclone, there is nothing you can do about it. You just have to move out of the place. No matter what you build, it will be blown away. Sea level rise is one of that. There is nothing you can do other than very super expensive building barriers. You can't build barriers for the whole 3,000, 4,000 kilometers, long coastline for India. So no matter whether it's sinking in some places or some places, even if it is not sinking, its sinking will only compound the impact of sea level rise. So sea level, they haven't gone, there isn't much evidence linking, combined effect of sinking and sea level rise, but it will only compound the effect of sea level rise, and everybody knows the Arctic sea ice is melting, and there could be summers, ice-free summers are possible soon in Arctic, and sea level rise is the biggest challenge. It is irreversible. See, if in the case of say agriculture, you can breed varieties which are temperature tolerant, pest tolerant, you can breed varieties drought tolerant, you can survive, but sea level rise is something you can't, it's irreversible. Even loss of biodiversity is irreversible.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think part of the question was that that the land sinking is also because of human use of water, groundwater,
that's
and
true, yes.
so
Lot of other factors.
yeah. So and also emissions is the other side of human activity.
Yes,
So
that's
the
true.
way
They're
they
all
are
linked,
related,
yes,
and
yes.
yeah, no, sure. So
40% of the world's population lives on the coast. So imagine they must be using all the water, soil, everything. and
yeah, in fact, cities have come up
city-
on the coasts
yes, on
and
the coast, yes.
yes.
Yeah, actually, the sinking is happening in Bangladesh also, like near India, and there the reason which has been attributed to the sinking is the people drawing like groundwater most often, and also the barrages which have been built there, because silt is not reaching there no longer, because it was a dynamic system. Silt was going there and getting deposited over the historical period, but now since we have the barrages, big barrages, then the silt is not getting there, and because of that excess silt, we have a lot of floods and a lot of river changing courses in Bihar and West Bengal and all those things. These things are really getting very much compounded, but I think within the IPCC framework, these things have been not adequately addressed. Even I was very interested in these kind of things. Yeah.
Thank you, sir, for the presentation. I noticed that you mentioned regarding when you were speaking about India needs to majorly shift to non-renewable sources. The first option there that I read was solar, And I mean, the question here is when solar's embodied energy is higher than what it can return, and at least in the photovoltaic component, then how can we expect a major shift to sort out? I mean, eventually the energy cost will be higher on the grid only. It will be grid based energy. So I'm just wondering how that shift can be actualized for, say, a nation like developing nation like India.
No, I don't think very inefficient solar panels. You may not have any great positive, negative reduction. But all the modern solar systems lead to net. Even if you take life cycle emissions, there is a net benefit. I don't think I've seen any literature saying all the solar PV in Europe and US, and even the one which are made by Tata Solar in Bangalore, which are exported to, in fact 80% solar panels from Bangalore Tata Solar exported to Europe. No, there is a net, even if you do the life cycle emission, as I said, there's a net emission reduction in solar. Because the only problem solar right now, the cost per kilowatt hour is still 3 times, 4 times more than coal. So no one wants to touch that, except there are very few in Germany, as of today, 40% of peak electricity comes from solar and wind. Even today, they want to really jack it up to 80%. So it's not greenhouse, it is climate friendly. Yeah, the solar panels have a life of 25, 30 years easily.
I'm curious as to how evolved is the science related to actually calculating all these emission numbers, in the sense, especially given wide disparity between the developed world and the developing countries in terms of how organized we are about our data. Could you talk a little bit more about the science behind actually calculating this stuff and how accurate that might be in a country like India?
No, this is very important because I'm this one, I do a lot of work on this also because as Rajiv also was saying, there is so little data on the contribution of urban sector for greenhouse gas emissions, or how different types of cities contribute differently to greenhouse gas emissions, how different land use mix. For example, if any of these, if you want, let's say if you are planning C Mahindra capital, there are so many opportunities really, but if you want to tell a politician, if you do this, this is emission reduction, there are no numbers for mitigation. But coming to the greenhouse gas inventory, under the UNFCCC procedures, all countries have to are legally bound to submit greenhouse gas emissions to UN. Next one, rich countries have to submit every year, and they are reviewed by experts. I am one of the experts involved in reviewing UK, US, German emissions, which are thoroughly reviewed. So all rich countries have to submit annually their greenhouse gas inventories, and they are reviewed. If there are errors, they have to be corrected. And this is based on the methodology guidelines developed by IPCC. Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has developed GHG inventory guidelines. I was one of the key authors for all the agriculture, forest, land use chapters. And we conduct training programs for developing countries. We look at the quality of data available, the capacity to really collect and archive, use it in inventory. That's a big challenge. That's the reason if you look at any number in IPCC, give a range. Emissions from land use sectors, 0.6 to 2.6 gigaton. Imagine the uncertainty involved. If you ask me, despite in being involved in so many IPCC chapters on forestry and having developed methodology guidelines for inventory, the range is 0.6 gigatons to 2.6 gigatons. You are right, there's a huge uncertainty in forestry, but the uncertainty is much less when it comes to petroleum, coal, natural gas, for example. It's very well known. You have a top-down method, you have bottom-up method. So IPCC provides both top-down and bottom methods to calculate, and you can also estimate the uncertainty. So for energy sector, the uncertainty is much less. I mean, you know how much coal is extracted. Of course, in India there is so much mafia involved in coal. You will never know exactly. But in Australia, Canada, UK, there are no mafias in coal extraction. But you are reasonably reliable with respect to some of these big fellows. But we are very bad on livestock, rice production, and say forestry. But others are reasonably okay. But on cities, on many aspects of cities, the data, as he said, is very limited. Even IPCC has highlighted the knowledge gaps.
I would also like to point out that whatever uncertainty we have in the follow sector, maybe in the agriculture sector, in the land use sector, it is applicable to all the countries, as to India, as to Canada. So in the end, all those things will be cancelled out. That's what the feeling is. Even though, so at the global level, we'll get a good picture about who is emitting, who is emitting what, how much.
Normally there will be, the statistical averaging will happen.
Yeah, and also the idea is that as you keep estimating them and as reviewers keep checking them over the years, maybe 10 years, 20 years down the line, then your inventory methods will get mature and you will reach a maturity level which is the best possible accuracy you can reach in that sector. Yeah.
But what we know is good enough to take action. We don't need to wait for any more knowledge, more reliable scientific predictions, and we don't need, the knowledge we have is adequate to take serious action.
Yeah, that was a lovely presentation of the report. Thank you for that. It was, looking, you have drawn attention to it many times, that it's quite disappointing that governments and policy bodies are not not taking it up with enough seriousness and so on. So what potential, as far as mitigation options go, how can individuals take it up? That is where perhaps in large numbers, if governments are not taking it and policy bodies are not taking it up, as individuals, what are the possibilities of where it can make a good impact?
No, I agree. It's always, you have to start with consumers, for example. At least I can see in Western Europe, there's a huge awareness about carbon dioxide emissions associated with many things. You go to universities, they are really green. In Western Europe, most universities are becoming carbon neutral, literally. Even universities have quotas, they have to reduce their emissions. University campus, like this university institute, should have, in fact, I'm involved in a committee. In fact, I wrote a report also for the Ministry of MHRD, Human Resource Developments, on greening institutions, centrally funded research institutes like IITs, IIMs, IAC, NIITs and so on. So it's possible, individuals can reduce, institutions can reduce, whether it's Infosys or Wipro, they also, all of them, they use so much energy for air conditioning and so on. There's opportunity for individuals, for establishments, institutions to reduce emissions. But there is one number I didn't give, I should give. The governments, on the one hand we say, government, if you ask the finance minister, say we have no money, if you have to shift to solar, wind, biomass, the incremental cost is so much high. You give us the technology, give us the funds, we will shift to low carbon pathways. That's exactly what Indian Prime Minister would say. But there is a number which is in IPC report also, the global subsidy on fossil fuels, petrol, coal, natural, is $600 billion per year. $600 billion per year is a subsidy from US to Middle East countries, oil producing countries, where of course almost petrol is cheap, it's like free, to India, China and so on. There is so much subsidy going to fossil fuels, which promotes not only climate change but also local pollution and so on. But people say all you have to do is just stop this subsidy for fossil fuels, coal, natural gas, petroleum, and shift to clean energy. The problems are solved. You don't need to find any new money. But imagine doing anything like this in India. Kerosene is free, diesel is subsidized, electricity is free for farmers, and all of it is used inefficiently, and all the benefits are going to the rich. It's not even reaching the poor. So given that it's a politically, we know we have the solutions. Even John Kerry says, yes, we have the solutions. We don't have the will. That's the only thing. $700 billion of subsidy going into polluting fuels. Why should they go? If we shift, whether the US or India or China, if you are rational, you won't subsidize them.
There is one aspect which I feel this I've gone through the WG3 report. I feel it doesn't draw enough attention to the impact of livestock, raising livestock, and which many other reports have brought out rather well. And one of the top environmental scientists, Robert Goodland, has brought out the very significant mitigation potential of reducing, say, livestock numbers. If even it is reduced by 25%, the impact can be really, really significant. And why is it that these reports do not talk about that aspect? That is one aspect, again, that, as consumers, by reducing demand, it can be both in terms of meat as well as dairy products, that can create a lot of difference. So why is that not been brought out in this report?
No, but I won't say it's not been brought out, but there is a chapter AFLU. If you look at the agriculture, forest, land use chapter, there is a full section on livestock emissions, full section emissions from rice production and meat production. I mean, these three, in fact, there's a nice graph, I have it in my pen drive, to produce whatever, some units of protein or something, the emissions from red meat versus vegetables to fruits and milk and so on. To get the same amount of protein, it's literally 10 times more. There is a nice graph showing the emissions per unit of protein produced. In fact, there are numbers for livestock. If you look at the AFLU chapter, chapter 11, actually I'm the author for this chapter, so I know a lot about that. And if we also talk about diet, for the first time, we say that there is a need to shift to more energy-friendly, carbon-friendly diet, excluding red meat. White meat, fish are all okay. Unfortunately, I don't eat that also. I eat only, I'm a vegetarian. So it's good for the world if you're being vegetarian. In fact, Dr. Pachauri always jokingly says, if North America and South Americans, Brazil, Argentina, they eat so much red meat, they eat much more than Germans and Americans or anyone. If South America and North America, they become vegetarian one day in a week, there will be significant drop in the emissions. One day in a week, you don't need and it will improve their health on top of that. But I agree, there is adequate coverage, I would say, on livestock management, rice production and meat production. It's there in chapter 11.
One question. Here, I think most of the mitigation strategies were primarily directed towards countries to make the changes, as well as at a city level that you showed. But none of these strategies were for the household level. I mean, you just now mentioned that probably changing diet is one strategy which could be considered, but probably a chapter just focusing on how household lifestyle changes could have a bigger impact at the global level. That is one question. And secondly, it's not clear to me as to which are the powers that are for climate change in the political negotiations, and which are the powers that are against it, and what is the trade-off there?
Yeah, now coming to the first question, it's all said, this is a global problem, climate change. I agree, individuals can make a small difference, but to really address a global climate change, you need big decisions. The big decisions can only be taken by governments. Governments can even drive your behavior. Governments can say, we'll just ban incandescent bulbs, period. One stroke of a pen, bulbs are gone. So it's so easy for governments to do that. Governments can simply say, cars emitting more than 100 grams per kilometer will not be permitted from 2020, period. One stroke of a pen, all automobiles in the world they have to invest billions and they will meet the target. So it's so easy for the governments, whether it's a car or whether it's this, or even if it is a meat, they can put whatever, they can put some conditions on calories, or you can say that meat cannot be transported. You go to the British supermarkets, you find food with air miles attached. You can get tomato grown locally in Kent or in England, and you can get tomatoes coming from Kenya and southern Italy. You can see clearly this has been flown from Kenya or South Africa to the supermarkets in England. You can see that. So governments can ban import of tomatoes. So it's so much easier for the governments to, with one stroke of pen, they can change anything. Whether from automobiles to food items to bulbs or anything, they can change. So and the change is required at a massive scale. So individual efforts, you and I, switching off light, switching off fan and all, will maybe it will 1%. We need 99%. That can happen only through governments. So of course, the other question is a bigger question. The best opportunity, since 1992, UNFCCC has been meeting every year. UN Climate Convention meets every year in different capitals, and all the environment ministers go there. They spend 3-4 days, and all the officers go for 2 weeks. It's every year in December 1st to December 15th, or around that time. 2 weeks of global Mela happens. And the Kyoto Protocol happened in 1997 after 1992, after several years, and it took many more years to get it ratified by governments to become a law. And that also people withdrew. Japan and Australia, Canada withdrew from Kyoto Protocol. And of course, you have to look at the huge histories from 1992 to 2013. You look at all the global conventions. I have gone to many of them, including the one where in 2009 in Copenhagen, everyone thought, because in 2007 there was an agreement in Bali where all the ministers met, and they called Bali Action Plan was formulated. And they said we have to agree by 2009, and by 2012 we'll implement the global new accord. Kyoto Protocol was to end in 2012. So everything was neatly worked out. There was a great debate in Bali. I was there also, and there was what's called Bali Roadmap. Bali Action Plan was prepared, very thorough. After years of work, 5 years of work, Bali Action Plan. And then they said from Bali 2007 to 2009, you had 2 years to come to an agreement. And 2009 was billed as the biggest opportunity, where all the presidents and prime ministers of 90 countries came. Barack Obama to Manmohan Singh to the Chinese prime minister, Japanese, all the leaders were there for 3 days. But because of politics, they couldn't agree. Who are on for? The only countries which are seriously for to address climate change are Western Europe. Germany, France, UK, Sweden, they are the stars. And Japan was a leader, but after this Fukushima, they have withdrawn from Kyoto Protocol. Actually, they withdrew even before that, but now they say that even Germany is closing down all the nuclear plants by in another few years' time. They're not building anymore. Japanese cannot close down, but actually they wanted to close down, but slowly they're opening one by one, because they have to import so much, 30% electricity coming from nuclear. They have to replace it with coal and natural gas or diesel. It's going to be very expensive. So it's very difficult. Actually, I keep telling whenever there's an opportunity in Delhi if I get many opportunities to tell the people matter, I say, in fact, once I told Prime Minister only, personally holding his hand, I told him, sir, climate change is most important for me, because don't worry about the emissions and US and so on. We have 1 billion people. Out of 600 million people depend on rainfall, they depend on forests, they depend on coastal areas, they depend on rivers for fishing. So we have 600 million people who depend directly on what we call climate sensitive sectors. And we should be worried more about than the Americans. There are 5 successive droughts in America. Nobody will starve in the US. They have enough storage, grains, they have enough land to grow. See, drought will never be in a massive country, only one part of US. So US can take care of it, Western Europe can take care of it. There are 5 droughts, but in India, if there are 2 successive droughts, it will be impossible for India to buy grains from the world market. The grains price will overnight that shoot up. Instead of $100 per ton, it will become $500 per ton. India will not be able to buy the grains. So I told the Prime Minister personally holding his land, we have 600 million people depending on forests, rainfall and fisheries and so on and so forth. Climate change will impact us most, and it impacts poor more. That means Prime Minister should be most worried about poor, not people in Delhi and Bangalore whose emissions will be threatened. Any action, people say, no, we have to reduce emissions. Americans are not doing enough and all. I keep telling them, forget about the middle class. There, once even I had an occasion to spend an hour with Rahul Gandhi. I was invited by him to his house to discuss climate change. I told him, he asked me, are you happy with what we are doing? I said, no. He asked me, does the Prime Minister know? I said, no. He doesn't know, he has no time. Maybe he's too old also to know. But really, Government of India thinks they are stuck with in the bunker of GHG emissions, as to use the Modi's word. He says, why should we reduce emissions? Our emissions are only 2 tons, 3 tons, whereas America is 19 tons. So why should we reduce? I agree. they should set the lead, they should take lead, they have to reduce their emissions. But we should also, as I was saying, in 1992, developing countries accounted only for some 35% of the global emissions. Today, they account for 65% of the emissions. By 2020, when the new emissions should take into action, developing countries will account for 80% of the emissions. So I still remember in Copenhagen, Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, it was all reported in the local media and the television saying, when the Chinese prime minister didn't come for the meeting, even though he was in the hotel, Obama, Gordon Brown, Manmohan Singh, they were all there. Chinese sent a deputy minister. She was very angry, she was furious. And China said, we will not do anything. Only Annex 1 countries, the rich countries should do. Then Angela Merkel banged the table, that the tea cups fell down, saying, China's emissions will account for 30-40% by 2020. How can they say we will not do anything? We will only do domestically. We will not do anything under international agreements. So there's a difference between the US says the same thing. We'll do domestically, but we don't want to be bound by any international agreements. But to have this huge emission reduction, you need a global, legally binding agreement saying all of us will reduce emissions by 20% by this year, 30% by this year. UK has a target of 80% of electricity from renewables by 2050. They have their own parliamentary act. It's not a law, and it's a law. So UK is working towards that. So that way, there are a few countries who are ready to take some burden. There's no free lunch. Someone has to pay. I told her, Mr. Rahul Gandhi asked me, what does it cost if India has to? I said, no, nothing. All the rich people like you and me, urban middle class, will have to take we have to pay small tax on petrol, on electricity, whatever you use. We charge 5 rupees more for petrol as a carbon tax and use it for subsidizing renewables. I said, what's the problem? He said, but well, the problem is that, there are politics involved. They don't want to see how does it cost for us paying 5 rupees more for a liter of petrol or paying another 50 paise more per unit of electricity. That money will go to promote renewables. That money will go to promote forestry. It's possible. There is no burden. Nobody says poor should be burdened. As they say, India is hiding behind the poor. Our emissions are low because poor people they're so poor, their emissions are low except livestock and other emissions. There are no emissions from them. So the Indian middle class or rich are hiding behind the poor. Same in, of course, Chinese emissions are also high. You can't say. China and US are the biggest threats for global environment as of today. They are the biggest barriers to any agreement. The US and China, they don't want to be part of any global legally binding agreement, but all other countries are ready to be a part of a global legally binding agreement. We should really completely get rid of coal. Actually, I forgot, I don't know how, there's one slide which shows there's so much coal available, you can for next 100 years, you consume or even more, you can get coal. There's no problem with coal at all. Oil, gas, there is some limit, but of course gas with fracking and all, the US has found a new way of using gas. They're very happy with that. US is exporting coal. That's the funniest joke. US exporting coal to Europe. So there are very few countries who are serious. Who are the countries who are the most serious about climate change, who spend sleepless nights, who cry on the dais, or small island countries, Maldives, Suriname, whatever you name it, small island countries, Malay. They are the ones who are most worried. Next, the most worried are countries like Ethiopia, Sudan, who are their prime ministers, presidents. They come and they are the ones they're shouting, but no one listens to them because they're not powerful. The countries most worried about climate change are rightly so small islands and countries like Ethiopia, Sudan, where they have drought periodically, they have no water. They are the countries most worried. Other than that, few countries of Western Europe like UK, Germany, Sweden, no one else is worried, seriously.
Other questions? Any responses?
Given that the biggest internal political problem in China at the moment is the environmental degradation, do you think that there could be a shift in their national policy?
Yes,
towards
it's happening in China. It's happening not because of the global demand or anything, because of the air pollution and so on. And so I know there's a big question is whether economic development first, and once people become richer, they want clean environment, they want clean water, they want parks, they want nature regeneration and so on. You know, South Korea is one of the best examples if you ask me. 40, 50 years ago, South Korea was worse than India. Everybody was using fuel wood, they were cutting down forests, there was all pollution, but today South Korea is completely unbelievable. So China, hopefully, the world will not drive them, but they're only middle class people in big cities may drive change. They don't want to live. In fact, I was reading a story in Economist last week. Economist, there's a story. The Chinese upper middle class are leaving China. Once they make money, they want to go to UK, Australia, Canada, and so on. The reason is, if you want to become very rich, stay in China. But if you want good life, leave China. That's a message. Economist, recent issue of Economist. So I agree, you're right. Local pressures may change, but still, they need so much energy. Where will they get it? They are burning 1.5 billion tons of coal. 1.5 billion tons. India burns only 500 million tons. So they are getting, unless they get, how can they get so much energy from solar, wind, biomass? No way. So Chinese, maybe they can go for clean coal technologies which are emerging, IGCC and so on. Maybe there may be high technological change using coal, carbon capture storage. There are options available.
So on the 14th, I'm running a meeting in Beijing, pretty much on this question, with the State Council and a whole range of city mayors from across China. So two things. In their last plan, they made a fairly solid commitment to energy efficiency, which we have not made in this country yet. And the Chinese, typically when they make a commitment, they tend to move very strongly in that direction, and they've made a big difference. So energy efficiency in buildings, they had a 10% target, they've done pretty well on that. They made a massive investment post 2008 on dealing with high-speed rail and also high-speed freight transportation, which is going to make a big difference to them in the long run. It's a I would say almost $1 trillion investment in that sector, and that's starting to affect functioning within China quite extensively. So they're taking a fairly long view of it. But the issue is really the momentum of both population growth, which is slowing just now, but really of consumption demand, because per capita incomes are now touching the high middle income end, and all that suppressed consumption demand is sort of emerging. Plus, of course, China's own role as an exporter to the world. So it's a mix of all those things. And in fact, the really good thing that this AR5 has done is to split up the production and the consumption metrics, because then you get a sense. I know it isn't, but it's still a beginning, because what it shows is that if you take an export orientation and then you start looking at the environmental backpack, you need to sort of adjust for those figures. But the big issue is just the growth that's there, and that's not going to slow very easily. And the Chinese know that. That's why they're trying to protect their own environment, at least in terms of land and land cover, and draw in resources from somewhere else. But environmental quality, especially both air and water pollution, is really bad in many parts of China. Though India also is starting to compete, very severely. Delhi now is probably between number 1 and number 3 in the world, depending in terms of air pollution, in spite of all the stuff that we've done. So we are not immune to this particular set of challenges, and it's hard, because these are things that go into the global commons, and they come back to bite you. So and if you look at both Working Group 2 and 3, at the adaptation and mitigation sort of reports together, from the adaptation side, what we were saying is, the first thing is, that's a common thing, it actually comes from Working Group 1, and that is that a 2-degree world is absolutely certainly here, and we are headed, if we look at these emissions at the current rate and the growth rates that drive them, we are headed towards the 4-degree world, and maybe even worse if you're going, whatever it is, to 8.5, etc. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, the adaptation report is very clearly saying that there are very clear and hard limits to adaptation. As we go into the 2050s, 60s and 70s, there are absolutely hard limits in adaptation. And in our chapter on cities, when we did the assessment of those 4 cities, that's the most striking thing that that struck us when we did it. Basically, after a point of time, irrespective of whether you're London or New York or whatever it is, you just cannot adapt any further. Essentially because ecosystem services start collapsing, food supplies, all the stuff that we know from the airflow side will stop. They will stop functioning. So you have to manage with extreme ecologies to deal with that kind of question. So if you take the trajectories and the limits to adaptation, the only thing that you really have to do just now is very rapidly move on the mitigation front, because it is the mitigation that will give you the space to adapt. And if you're poor in any case, as we've seen and we're starting to do now on the ASAR research program here, if you're poor, you're already adapting. You're adapting to a whole range of circumstances which drive you into poverty, which is the development side. But you're adapting to a whole range of other processes, which, whether it's drought at one end or extreme rainfall at the other end, you're adapting. But as a system, you have a very, very serious challenge. And these are non-linear processes. So after a point of time, the feedbacks within that system itself make it extremely difficult to solve. So the question of comprehension of this and what this means is part of the challenge. The science can say whatever you want, but people really have to believe that even though this seems to be slow onset, and it's not like a volcanic eruption or a whatever it is, even a cyclonic storm, this is serious and it's irreversible. And if you don't do something about it, it will cause massive dislocation. And it's not like massive in the small scale; it's massive in the big scale. Hundreds of millions of people are going to be affected in this subcontinent and otherwise, and they'll be affected irreversibly, especially towards the end of the century when sea level rise. Sea level rise is not going to be obvious just now. You'll start seeing some impact, salinization, all this kind of stuff. But once that starts, then they're going to be irreversible. It'll take maybe 300-400 years for that kind of process to work itself out, and that's hard. We haven't really completely cognized this. Some countries have, because it's survival.
Nicholas Stern always talks about massive human migration. In all his talk, he says maybe 50 million people from Bangladesh may want to move out if there is sea level rise and floods. Where will they go? You can't shoot them if they want to cross the border. They'll all come to India. So there will be a massive movement from Africa and many poor countries.
Yeah, in fact, that's one of the things that we're going to be doing. The Deltas Consortium that's looking at in sort of the Brahmaputra or the Padma and the basin here, there are a whole range of processes. We're talking about subsidence. As it is morphologically, it's quite complex, these coastal environments. On top of that, you're adding a whole range of other processes. The fluid environments are very, very complex to deal with. So you have to understand what's happening, and before you actually find subsidence by water or otherwise, impacts in terms of salinity are already starting to happen, because there are limits to what you can manage. So you can move to, let's say, rice, which can manage with higher levels of salinity. The intertidal zone will change. So there are a whole range of processes which, as we said, the impacts are already observable. The question is how much people can actually cope and adapt in the short run, and then what are they going to do? Because the bigger questions I would think in the medium to short run are social and political questions, because the breakdown will not start happening when your food supply starts stopping. People will start being quite bothered about it and start pushing back on your political systems much before that. They're not stupid, especially in a day where internet and everything is available. People know exactly what is happening to them. So those are the more sort of complex things that we're dealing with. The challenge of negotiation and coming to a compact is not easy. Even though the IPCC is focused very strongly on the science and the evidence and stuff like that, essentially what's happening in these meetings is a precursor to the global negotiations. Working Group 2 in Berlin was in a sense is a sort of precursor to the FCCC negotiation, where people are fighting to take out graphs because it makes them look bad. The first burning embers diagram that was there, we had about 3.5 hours of debate just on where the x-axis would lie. Okay, whether you had pre-industrial or post-industrial x-axis there, because it has an implication in terms of investment, in terms of that, that 600 billion you're talking about. 600 billion, 700 billion is about 1 trillion of world product. So if you're doing, the global product is about 70 trillion at the moment. If you're doing 1% as subsidies, Now the question is who derives from those subsidies? There's obviously, there is a very large energy industry, and the energy industry in some countries, including the States, etc., and even in China, is very, very influential in terms of democratic politics. They define whether climate is a problem or not in some ways, etc. So they're very, very large forces at play, and they enter into the scientific debate, as you can see. I mean, we had the same issue. Things were taken out, things were put in to address these questions. So you have to understand the politics of this. I mean, you know, Sunita and Anil had, when they written this book way, way back around the time of Rio '92 about green politics, it is about these forces at play. So I think we shouldn't be naive about these processes. Some of the things that we do are useful and interesting, but they're much larger forces at play. So I think it's sort of incumbent on us to try and understand what those processes are like and engage those sort of actors and stakeholders in those debates. Like, you know, yesterday I was in Barcelona with UCLG, which basically, you know, is the association of all the mayors in the world. And the thing that we were looking at was, in the new Sustainable Development Goal process, which, you know, we're quite involved with here at IHS, there is a fairly strong move to actually exclude climate as a goal. And the question is a trade-off. So, you know, we have 16 goals, climate is there. It's very weakly defined, and it's defined saying if FCCC and COP 21 agrees on it, then we'll have a goal. But the question is, you know, it's been positioned as, should we have health, universal health coverage, or should we have climate? So any, you know, or should we have, you know, employment for all, or should we have climate? So politically, when somebody is looking at an election in 1 year or 3 or 5 years' time, you know, it's very clear where they would go. They would go for jobs, they go for health, they go for education, and they go for poverty. And climate is too complicated, so we leave it out. Because they're not, people are not, I mean, let's say the future generation, so to speak, including those of us who will still be alive, doesn't have a vote in that space. So there's a real problem of dealing with these long-term global externalities and building a frame that will actually work for us. Good, but the science is important, and like you said, the cities, there's a real problem here. I mean, you know, I guess this is something that we should look at in terms of doing joint work together. They've been very rough and ready inventories done for India, and they're pretty badly off, because, you know, we've tried to look at Bangalore and other cities. They may be off by an order of magnitude in some cases. So that's a very serious problem. But if you don't have the evidence, then it becomes very difficult to then look at the trade-offs that are there, whether it's on the technological side or the institutional side, of what needs to get done to make things different. Because, for example, if you want to actually enable a compact city, which is a great flavor these days across the world, you cannot do that without intervening in the land market. Fine? And you can't intervene in the land market unless you know what you're doing, because, you know, the land market is very powerful forces functioning in it. We work on land quite a lot here. But it also has large amounts of money. So if you sort of try and make an intervention and it backfires, you should be able to find citizenship in another part of the world quite quickly. I mean, it's a 10,000 crore kind of mistake that you could make. So building that analytical frame, putting that stuff together is interesting and difficult, or even the work on water for that matter. How you bring the water work together and try and look at that. Okay, any?
You mentioned about the adaptation limits to adaptation based on those 4 cities.
Yeah, 5.
So, okay, those 5 cities.
Yeah.
So was this like linked to 2-degree target, or is it already happening? Like,
no, we looked at, actually there are 2 scenarios that were there, both 2 and 4 are there. There's a table, I don't have it with me, but the table is at the back of the chapter as an annex. There was a big debate because we wanted to actually put it into the SPM. Okay. They didn't allow us to put it into the SPM. And there was a good technical reason for not doing that, because when we met to review the second order draft, we suddenly realized that while the SPM in working group 2 was trying to look at synthetic ideas, there was nothing on cities, and there was nothing on cities precisely because there was no evidence. So what we did is we had 4-5 case studies that were done. We got the case study authors to go back, re-examine the evidence, and actually validate it with the city governments. So for example, the mayor's office in London actually signed off on that assessment. We went through a formal process. Same thing, Bloomberg was there in New York, so we got their team to sign off. Thankfully, of course, some of us were involved in that process. So the reason that it was not put in was because it was not subject to the normal peer review process by the governments, and they said, okay, don't do it. But if somebody was a little bit forward looking, they would have said this is really important, because this is something that strikes you immediately. So we had Durban, we had Dar es Salaam, we had New York, we had London, and we had Rio. I would have really liked to have done it for Bangalore, but we just didn't have the data. It would have actually got in and it would have become a fairly important benchmark for us. But the data for us was very difficult to actually pull together. So it looks at all the, I think there are 7 or 8 different thematic areas that are there, from food systems to water, etc., etc. And it basically looks at the potential for adaptation in RCP, whatever it is, 6.5 and 2.5. That's how it's structured. So this is a method which I think we need to take forward. So in fact, in the new book that we're doing and the ARC, there's a new, there's a sort of IPCC for cities that's being run by colleagues from the US, out of Goddard. Cynthia Rosenweg, who's my co-chair, she's leading that process now, and we're doing, I think, 60, 70 cities from across the world. So that process is being defined. I think we need to try and sort of deepen that in India, especially on the indirect side. The direct side is relatively easy to do. The indirect side is much more complicated, and linking the indirect to the economic processes is even more complicated, because on that we not only need to look at output, we need to look at employment, because for a country like ours, the employment implications are very important. If you can show that a mitigation or adaptation intervention is going to actually create jobs, which is a part of the green growth story, and also do something in terms of value addition or productivity, then I think you have an idea which can be sold and become sort of policy palatable. Otherwise, it's one more tax or one more thing that's there. We have to try and bring together those things. But for that, you need an analytical frame that actually works. And we have we've got to go some distance before we actually get that far. Good, so can we sort of shut down? Yeah? Thank you very much. It's been a nice conversation. We hope to have more of this stuff here. And as I guess, we develop our own capacities in research here, I'm hoping that we can do some joint seminars together. There will be a lot more original stuff happening as we start working in 3-4 major, we're doing Bangalore, Aurangabad, and a few other cities over the next 4 or 5 years, plus the rural-urban transition, which is very important, because in India, especially in drought-prone areas, that is the real challenge. How much migration will happen, how people will cope, etc. Those questions we're going to be spending some detail in. Good, so thank you so much. Thanks for coming. Nice to have people from ISC here. Bye.